on in the Spanish Peninsula, sort of. I mean, it was months and months and months late, but they knew about those wars. That wasn't that kind of a war. This was a war here at home in their own backyard. More of it was a war that, like the Revolution, threatened to divide families and sever ties across the border that were an intimate part of colonists' identity. Now, this is not to suggest that Upper Canadians were not aware that living on a borderland had some difficulties. The colony had been created, after all, to be a loyal colony. But geographic proximity, I think, encouraged this sense of community, and Upper Canadians themselves were very conscious to maintain good relations. And so and it's interesting, in the papers, for example, we get lots of references to, being very pleased that the garrison on the American side had shown the colony's flag and played British Grenadiers on the occasion of the King's birthday. One colonist on Niagara suggested that they get together with their American counterparts for sporting events. Horse racing was actually quite popular, it seems, and they sort of thought that they should have a friendly match from folks across the border. Such acts of civility, again and again, they're being told, should be encouraged. There was a real concern that Friends needed to do this to maintain their national prosperity, as well as their sort of sense of good feeling. Now, what's interesting is they also knew, however, that this border could create some real problems. We get smugglers, counterfeiters, criminals on one side of the border would whip across the border to sort of go, you can't get me, from authorities on the other side. And we get lots of reports of this. The British government was particularly concerned because British soldiers would desert across the border. Many of them would join the American forces. And you can imagine British officers are apoplectic about all of this. And people are very conscious that this happens, and what they do is they turn around and say, no, we cannot afford to do this. We cannot afford to allow these things to happen. This becomes a particular issue after 1807 because at that point, in fact, it's an issue after 1800. In 1800, they put customs duties on the border. The American government puts customs duties on, and most people just ignore them. Smuggling was a lucrative and relatively respectable, 1 minute?
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Oh, lots of time. Relatively respectable thing to do. But it becomes a real problem in 1807 because the American government puts on an embargo, and the smuggling just increases. And you actually get reports from both sides of the border how officials who are trying to stop smuggling fear for their lives. Now, what's interesting is that on both sides of the border, but particularly in Upper Canada, we get this sense of we need, in fact, to preserve the peace on the border. Our own identity, our own security relies on this. And I think, on the whole, people were really quite successful. The problem, of course, is that good relations at a local level did not mean good relations at a national level. And between 1794 and 1812, Upper Canadians and, in fact, Americans watch as their governments sort of jockey for position and try and figure out what's going to go on. For Upper Canadians, this is a really serious problem. And for Upper Canadian leaders, it's a particular problem because the question is whether Upper Canadians would fight if there was a war. And in 1807, when there is a major war scare, after what's called the Chesapeake Affair, we get a quite active, in the beginning of a very detailed propaganda campaign to convince Upper Canadians that if, by chance, if in the absolute horrors that we actually get war with the United States, Upper Canadians should fight, and they should fight, however, because they're defending not only their own lands, but they're fighting to protect the interests of friends in the United States who don't want to go to war in the first place. And so what we get, and I'll just give you a taste of this propaganda, and it comes out of a speech given to the militia in 1807, where Richard Cartwright of Kingston talks about the fact that it was the American government and the Republicans, what he calls that blind and misguided party, who were threatening to plunge the continent into war. The most enlightened and patriotic citizens of the United States, the Federalists, he says, realized that war would harm American commerce and ultimately the existence of their independence. Thus, by defending themselves, Cartwright said, Upper Canadians would be defending as well their friends in the United States. And what's interesting is that propaganda campaign goes up and down between 1807 and 1812, but it is completely consistent. And the consistent, so we actually begin to get rhetoric which talks about the tyranny of the Jeffersonian first and then the Madison governments. We get the Republicans are linked directly to Napoleon. They're characterized as, quote, cunning pretenders of liberty and equality. They were corrupt and venal speculators, the avowed patrons of slavery and dealers in human blood. Again and again, however, the Canadian or Upper Canadian newspapers never, ever question the patriotism or courage of the American people. We know, they say, that the best men in the nation, the men of the greatest talents, courage, and wealth in the United States, are opposed to war. Only the most worthless part of the population, the refuse and scum of the earth, renegades and vagabonds, savages of the worst description, would take up arms against other Canadians. And so what we get is this, here we've got communities which are just trying to cope. They're just trying to work on the situation. But they're communities who have also got a very definite sense of community across a border, not with each other, in very real terms. And so when you're threatened with war, how do you cope with this? Because you are being told that at the stroke of a pen, you're likely to now become enemies. But you're being enemies with family, with friends, with associates, with almost yourself. I think Alan Taylor's right when he talks about this being a civil war. I'm not sure he's right with his conclusions about where that civil war, the ramifications of that civil war. But this is, and so if you're sitting on the precipice, and of course what happens in June of 1812 is they fall off the precipice. Through no fault of their own. They're actually pushed off the precipice. And when you're pushed off the precipice, they then have to cope. They actually don't like it, and many of them resist, as I'm sure we'll find out later. But that's my story of living on the precipice. Thank you very much.
Now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Françoise Noel. Françoise is a professor of history at Nipissing University in North Bay. She has been there since 1988 and served twice as chair of the history department. Her research areas have focused on settlement in eastern townships and seigneurial administration in the Upper Richelieu Valley, to family life in 19th century Quebec and Ontario, and family and community history in northeastern Ontario. And she continues to promote the history of northeastern Ontario through her research and teaching. Her book, Family and Community Life in Northeastern Ontario, the Interwar Years, won the Fred Landon Award in 2009. So welcome, Françoise, and thank you for coming from North Bay.
Thank you, Gail, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to basically talk about the background in terms of Lower Canada, and with a little bit more emphasis on the lives of women and what the lives of women was like in this time period. What you have here is Bouchette's map of Lower Canada from 1815, and you have to just kind of swing it upwards a bit because the red line at the bottom is the U.S. border, and it should be east-west rather than on an angle. You can sort of see Upper Canada in the corner, and the eastern townships are this whole area here, and this is the area where the Americans had settled, who had come not as loyalists so much as late loyalists, and in many ways they're the same people that Jane was just talking about, and they lived with close ties to the United States in the same way as well. And Methodist circuits, for example, in this time period just went across the border. And one of the fun stories about the War of 1812 is that there were these huge buildings built on the border, with the building actually crossing the border, and it was for smuggling. But the Methodists used these buildings for their love feast. And so they would meet, and each group would be on the right side of the border, but they were actually together in the same building. So this gives you a bit of an idea of how the War of 1812 was a little bit different in that kind of context. This area here has a few townships as well, and Châteauguay is just here south of Montreal. This is where the Voltigeurs beat a major army, of course, and Montreal is here, St. Lawrence. So the French Canadians basically lived along the St. Lawrence on the seigneurial lands, And the only other area where there were a number of English people is right here. That's along the Richelieu. I did once upon a time do a PhD on the Christie seminaries, and it's funny how all of this is coming together in this talk. Christie had a number of Americans living, loyalists actually in his case, living on his seminaries, including Jonathan Odell, who was the person for the, that the Odell town is named for, where one of the battles of the War of 1812 was. And if you look at this close-up map, you can actually see La Colle, the domain, the La Colle Mill, which is another site of a battle during the war. And then there's the woods, and just a little bit up is there's a reference actually on, and it's interesting, I mean, Bouchette did this in 1815, right? So he actually refers to the Indian camp, he refers, and Chardonnay is just a little bit up and so on. But it gives you an idea how this area is still a very limited settlement, very few actual people living in this area. The townships, of course, the Americans had settled on townships because of free and common stockage tenure. The other areas were seigneurial tenure, and the Christie seigneurials were the exception in that you had American, English-speaking settlers living in a seigneurial area. To speak about women in this time period, of course, it's impossible to speak about all women as one. It's a very stratified society, so there's about 10% at the top who are fairly well off. There's a kind of a middle 60%, and then there's a lower part that's about 30% of the population. I mean, using figures from 1825, we know that there's about 400,000 people in Lower Canada. It's about half of that, I think, in 1812. The figures for 1812 aren't quite as accurate. And I wanted to get a bit of a sense of the proportions. So 17% were British origin, 83% were French Canadians. So the American settlements in the eastern townships and so on are just, a really small group of people, plus the British are also in the cities, particularly Montreal and Quebec, because they're engaged in commerce. And Quebec and Montreal in 1825 were each just over 22,000 people. So the French Canadians living in the countryside, who were mostly peasant farmers and illiterate, were basically where the British government expected to get their militia, because they didn't have a lot of forces in the colony at the time that the war was building up. They were a little bit worried about whether or not the French Canadians would fight. As it turned out, that wasn't a problem, and there's a recent study that basically shows that half of the militia officers were in fact French Canadians. In terms of the voltigeurs, there's a wonderful article by Martin Auger who talks about the voltigeurs in detail. You could look that one up. And he basically talks about the Salaberry, the leader of the voltigeurs. And the Salaberry had actually been with the 60th Regiment. So he was actually a British military officer and from that old nobility. But when he talks about the recruiting, of course, they all got paid. So there was a bonus, there was a signing bonus. So that was one of the reasons people joined the militia. So it wasn't a patriotic war, it wasn't a war because it was basically you're defending your country because the Americans are going to come and invade. And, other than that, it was basically if you could get something out of it, a little bit of a job for a few years, and get paid for it, it was that kind of thing. In the eastern townships, there was a lot of smuggling, and as I mentioned, those buildings were used for smuggling, and there didn't seem to be too much concern over that. The American supplies basically fed the British Army. So it was a very much... I love Atkinson's introduction to the War of 1812 in his Irish in Ontario. He's got a chapter up Louise and Lansdowne where he talks about basically people were very local in their interests, and they were selfish, atomistic, and they were basically doing what was good for them. So and I think this would basically apply to this area as well. The Americans and the British, of course, were, the American farmers were yeomen. They saw themselves as yeoman farmers rather than peasant farmers, and they were literate, so they stand out from the French-Canadian peasant farmers who were illiterate, and the British, of course, are mostly in trade and commerce and so on. Trade is starting to move into the countryside, so there is some stratification in the peasantry as well. They're not all as well off one as the other, but changes in levels of wealth will tend to be primarily in terms of how much property you own so that you can leave more sons of farm and that sort of thing. The other thing that I want to mention, which is obviously very important in terms of women and women's role in this society, is that the custom of Paris applies. This is French civil law, and the vast majority of people, with the possible exception of a few of the British, live in a common property regime. So basically, women and children have rights to property from the time of marriage. So when a woman marries and she signs a contract with her husband, the marriage contract, she has ownership in the joint property, and all of the children born to that marriage have ownership rights in that property. So it's a somewhat different system from other places, and it does obviously have a pretty major impact on women. And it's not until after the rebellions that begins to be eroded with codification of the civil law, with some of the changes, registry offices, attempts to kind of get rid of dowry rights, or at least to make them visible in the registry office, registration of property, and things like that. But for the period that we're looking at, basically they do have those rights. And production is still mostly in the household. So women and children participate in production. Women act for their husbands whenever their husbands are away. Children work at various things. It's really still